Hey everybody, today is Monday, June 26th, 2023. Coming up on the show today, from the new Netflix animated feature Nimona, editor Randy Trager.
Because we're just there and we know what we need or want, editors will always be recording themselves to put themselves in. Not as a heyday, but just we need a line here. A lot of times when we do put these things together for the first time, every sequence feels like a reset. Steps 1 through 4, where you can come in on a scene on 3 and get out halfway through 4. It was pretty emotional to see all those names, and there are these people you've known for years, and maybe people you've just known in passing, but you've known them for so long.
Yes, all that and a little more on this edition of The Rough Cut. Well, hey kids, how you doing? How's things? Hope you're good. Thanks as always for dropping by. We have got a fun little field trip to the world of feature animation once again today. I think you'll like it. Editor Randy Trager is making a return trip to the Rough Cut. He's here to share the inside story of how his latest film, Nimona, went from dead on the cutting room floor to alive and loud on Netflix. Soon. It comes out this Friday. Randy was last on the show in 2019, along with co-editor Chris Campbell, to talk about his work on Blue Sky Studios' Spies in Disguise. Little did any of us know at the time that that would be the last film released by Blue Sky. As for Nimona, it actually did begin its development life under the banner of Blue Sky Studios and its parent company 21st Century Fox. But then Nimona and the rest of the Blue Sky team were moved under Disney during their acquisition of Fox. The film's rocky development road seemingly ended in April 2021 when Disney shuttered Blue Sky, but with her relentless never say die attitude, Nimona and the dedicated storytellers supporting her found new life again with Annapurna Pictures and Netflix. As far as what the film is about, Nimona tells the tale of Ballister Boldheart, a knight in a futuristic medieval world who is framed for a crime he did not commit. The only one who can help him prove his innocence is Nimona, who is a mischievous, not mischievous, there's no such word, mischievous teen with a taste for mayhem. And she also happens to be a shape-shifting creature that Ballister has been trained to destroy. But with the entire kingdom out to get him, Nimona is the best and technically the only sidekick Ballister can hope for. So there you go. All right, back to Randy. Here's a little on his backstory. Mr. Trager began his editorial journey as an assistant editor on live-action features, such as Nurse Betty, What Women Want, and Men in Black 2, but then he made the move to working in feature animation as an assistant on Robots. After that, he got bumped up to the editor's chair on Rio, the Peanuts movie, and of course the previously mentioned Spies in Disguise. I am really interested in getting the inside scoop from Randy on not just Nimona, but what went down with Disney and Fox and closing down Blue Sky. Before we check in with Randy, if you could be so kind as to give me a minute to talk to you about the beautiful people who help to bring you this podcast, Extreme Music. Those are the folks you got to call about getting great music for your next project, animated or otherwise. For over 25 years, yes, that's a 2 and a 5, they've been helping filmmakers and other artists like you with the very best in production audio. Music created by multi-award-winning musicians and composers. Great music from names you know and a few you don't, but they are all super talented in the art of music making. All you got to do is just go to their website, sign up for a free account, and then start your search for any kind of music you need. You can get your tracks in all kinds of shapes and sizes, right down to the stems. You can even take advantage of their artful intelligence and upload a reference track so that they can search their catalog for ones like it. You can get it all done right there online, or they can personally lend a hand from one of their many worldwide offices to help you work out the licensing. Their amazing catalog is always growing with new music, and if you want to hear some of it, you can check out their Spotify playlist. So if you want to make sure your next TV show, movie, vlog, whatever sounds awesome, make sure you partner up with our friends and sponsor, Extreme Music. Now then, time for things to get a little animated on the podcast. Here to talk about the new Netflix film Nimona, editor Randy Trager.
It shouldn't just be a voice. You should have a show.
Oh, hey, from your lips to somebody's ears.
Yeah.
Well, Randy, the last and only time we've had a chance to speak to discuss your work was at the end of 2019 for Spies in Disguise, if you can think back that far. And at the time, I don't think either one of us realized that Spies in Disguise would be the last film for Blue Sky, the same studio that brought us Ice Age and Rio. Blue Sky was owned at the time by Fox, and then Disney acquired Fox, and as such acquired Blue Sky. And then in February 21, Disney shut down Blue Sky.
Yeah.
Some of the reasons cited largely had to do with COVID lockdowns and things like that. But basically by April 21, Blue Sky was done. I know it's not a pleasant memory, but it's certainly a unique insight into the business. If you could just tell us about that situation, how it impacted you and the team, and really what happened.
Yeah, well, Disney had bought us, I think, towards the middle end of Spies in Disguise, but everything was all systems go at that point, and they were supportive. That's not to say they were never supportive, but yeah, when COVID hit, it seemed like shaky ground was getting shakier in terms of why do they need us? They seem to be hemorrhaging money elsewhere. This is my take on it. I don't seem to be what was going on at the time, so it was probably a big savings for them to lay off upwards of 500 or 600 people. And so at that point, Nimona was already going. Nimona has had a long history prior to me being involved. It was years. In fact, I think when we were finishing Spies in Disguise, Nimona was already maybe a year or two into its first iteration with a different director. And just prior to COVID, that director left and they brought on Nick and Troy, who directed Spies. And 5 days later, the studio shut down. So they started working remotely with their editor, Marissa Horowitz, who did a fantastic job. Especially, she never even met the guys in person. She came from California to take over. I was on a development project at the time, and they did it remote, and they in very short order in terms of animation, they got the movie up on reels in I don't even know, could have been 6 months. A pretty solid version with her leading, and at the time I think a lot of the other editors were in between projects, so there was maybe 6 or 8 other people helping put together scenes and whatnot. So it was a really fast turnaround, which was great because I think it boosted confidence in the project and the new direction it was going in. So then they worked on that for almost a year before they announced the closing. And yeah, that was pretty devastating. I was at the studio myself 18 years, which was mind blowing because I had been freelance before that. And that's how I saw my life going. So I was very lucky to have been there for so long.
Not that the practical part of this is the most important, but just out of curiosity, when the studio got shut down, did everything get archived and packed away? Like, how did the digital and material assets get stored so that ultimately you could bring Nimona back to life?
Yeah, everything did get archived, I believe, on a lot of it was cloud based, particularly Nimona. A lot of assets were archived as well, in terms of the rigs for the characters and environments. There were probably a good handful of scenes that were either just starting animation or that had been animated. The rest would have been maybe just entering layout. All that material was archived. There wasn't a plan at that point. We didn't know what was happening. It was pretty chaotic at the time. And a lot of it was going on behind the scenes that most of us weren't even aware of. At the time, it seemed like the movie's over. The studio's closed. This is not going anywhere. And it was kept alive for a while, so it wasn't like immediately archived. But I think behind the scenes, as it became more of a possibility, efforts were taken to archive and set aside the materials that would be needed to move forward, including a whole storyboard library. All the Avid projects were archived, and the studio closed. It seemed like Nimona was not happening, and then it seemed like it was happening with a different studio, and that maybe they were going to be able to keep on 200 or 300 people to continue making it at Blue Sky. That idea fell apart pretty quickly. And it was on again, off again for a few weeks there. It was a bit of a roller coaster where people were really excited. I was at that point asked to come on because Marissa had already moved on. She's at Pixar now. So I was excited to go from, oh, shit, no job to, oh, man, great. I get to work with these great people on a project that seemed so great and had such potential. So maybe that was over the course of a month where it was uncertain whether or not it was happening or not. And then we got the green light that Annapurna had picked it up, and that was incredible.
In thinking about the situation that you went through and the way that you were able to resurrect the film, it kind of begs the question, certainly for animation, do you even need a physical studio anymore? I mean, other than being able to record the actors' voices somewhere, and if you wanted to have an actual orchestra for the score instead of creating it all digitally, it would seem like animation is the medium that you could have a virtual studio. Like, nobody needs to physically be, I mean, as nice as it is to have the team together for creativity and just camaraderie, that you could have a virtual animation studio.
I agree. I personally think so. So there was a core group of us doing the creative, whether it was the producers, the directors, and myself, managers, coordinators, etc., that were all working remotely. and we were putting together the reels. And then DNEG was the effects house that did, or the animation house in this case, that animated. And they were in London, Montreal, Toronto, and Mumbai. So everyone was all over the place. And a lot of those people worked remote. There were times where people would come together, where we would screen certain things, or we would want to look at maybe more finished shots for quality control purposes or timing purposes. If things on a big screen at a higher resolution looked better, or if we wanted more time on the shots, etc. But no, I thought it was really efficient working remotely, particularly for me editorially, because in animation, you're not just editing and sitting with the directors, you're in tons of meetings all day, whether they're story meetings, whether they're layout meetings, camera meetings, post-production meetings, or effects, like all these meetings that I'm just typically would be sitting there imagining all the work that's waiting for me back in my office that I have to go get back to, and people are having a conversation about subpixels or something that's just mind-numbing and driving me crazy. So it was great to be able to both be in meetings, and then maybe when the conversation didn't involve me or when it just went down some rabbit hole, I could turn back and continue cutting and working and have an ear on the meeting. So I found it really efficient to work that way. And I think I only worked with the directors editorially, I think twice in 2 years in person, until we got to London to do post. And then, we would do maybe more regular reviews together just because the Avid was there and it was easier to just walk into another room and then get on Zoom.
So you have this voiceover open, which seems to be more frequent in animation. I mean, voiceover is not unique to animation, but it seems more often than not in animation you have voiceover. And it got me thinking about maybe the practical reasons for doing this, whether it's budgetary or time-related or audience-oriented. Typically, your audience would include young people, kids, that this might be a more effective way of setting context and providing exposition than it may be in live action.
Yeah, that almost does seem to be an animation trope in that regard. And that's a portion of the film that we struggled with a lot on this one, is the first act essentially is how much information do we need to put out there, and grounding people in this world, which is a world they've sort of never seen, this combination of futuristic, medieval, and some of the rules in that kingdom. And so not my favorite thing to just have somebody talking. So we worked for a while in streamlining and distilling that first act. That was something we spent a lot of time, more than any other section of the movie, I think, trying to do that. We tried to maybe put it on its ear a little bit by doing a sort of sports highlight reel feel to it, which helped. That was a little too long at one point as well. But yeah, I would definitely agree that seems to be let's set the table for people and give them information. And I think sometimes it's not necessary. I will say, at least with this particular movie, that it was always that way from the outset, at least this version, where the intention was to sort of use that trope. So maybe people would think, oh, I'm in this fairy tale type of framework, and it's a story that somebody's telling, and I should believe it because it's reality. But later on, as we find out, that's not exactly the story. So here it was by design, for sure, to be that way. It wasn't any kind of Band-Aid.
What happens after the voiceover is you jump 1,000 years into the future. And then you have sort of a splashy Hollywood news report kind of piece setting up the whole movie and who this character of Ballister Boldheart is. Up until that point, you don't get the sense that this is going to be a funny movie. But as soon as you get into this new world, it's funny.
Yeah. The hardest thing I found to get a hold of is the tone. Tone is always a real tricky thing, especially when you're basically starting from scratch, and you're starting with scratch dialogue with non-actors, and the story is one thing on the script, but when it's boarded, it maybe translates to something else. And it's just this thing that is so intangible to find. And when it's found, you know it, but it is something that's sort of searched for a while. Lucky for me, on this show, there was a lot of tone work and story work that happened over the course of several years. So a lot of that was done way before I even came on. I think particularly with these directors, they do love, Nick and Troy, they do love playing with tone as well. They love to be able to set the stage and then sort of subvert it, where, I mean, I think we did the same thing pretty successfully in Spies, where it feels like it's serious, or there's characters within that world who take the world very serious. And then there's these other characters who do not at all, and or who bring comedy to the person who's taking it seriously, to the character that's taking it seriously. And that, I think, creates a lot of potential for fun and comedy. So I think it was always the case to be able to switch tones a lot in this movie. And Nimona, being the character that she is able to do that better than anybody.
In animation in a film like this, you got to make sure that the jokes are funny. Like, it's not just like a 6-year-old will laugh, but the parents are going to laugh. At the same time, you're trying to send a message, a very important message. Something that's come up before in conversations I've had with editors of comedies where there is a message to be sent is comedy undermining that message. Tell me a little bit about sending that message in a way that's funny, but also on point.
Yeah, that is always a tricky thing that we found. And I think, glean a lot of information about the success of that when we screen for an audience. They sort of tell us the message of this and meaning behind this movie was really important. So we were always hyper-focused on, the directors were always hyper-focused on not letting the comedy step on that and letting the comedy come from quote-unquote natural moments within the film. I don't think at least at my time on this film, we didn't struggle too much with the comedy getting in the way. There maybe have been a joke or two later on in the film that was misplaced or misdirected, so we pulled it out. But I think because they were hyper-focused on it the whole time, it was always in a nice balance.
That's not an easy thing to get right. And I think you guys nailed it in terms of just creating an entertaining film that also really does let the heart of the message resonate with the viewer.
I'll take it and I'll pass it on to others. Who's not with us here today is Erin Crackle, who was the other editor on this, who was on the project the longest. I think she was on it for 6.5 years.
Wow.
She was like the one constant from the very early version to this version. And she's already on another project and is getting ready for a screening. So unfortunately couldn't join us.
Well, definitely pass along my compliments to her and a pat on the back for staying with any project for 6 years. That's something.
Yeah.
All right. So I think we've justifiably gone through the tone aspect. If you wouldn't mind, I want to go back to some of the technical aspects of doing animation. And that's the style. I know as an editor, you wouldn't necessarily think you would have much input into style, but then again, an animation editors seem to be integrated in so many more ways than you would think possible. Tell me about developing the style of animation. And are there established styles in animation? Is there a Disney style, a Pixar style, a Bluth style of animation? Are those recognizable looks that you can talk about as reference points in an animated film?
Yeah, I think those styles do exist, particularly with whether it's Disney, whether it's 2D or 3D CG, and same thing with Pixar. A film like this, from the get-go, they had a very specific style that they wanted to be, which was this combination of 3D CG, high resolution, with a 2D layer to it, whether it was 2D shading on a character's face or on materials, where sometimes you look at a surface on a character and it's hyper real, but then you also can look at another element of the same surface and it was 2D. I think they wanted to keep it still grounded in the look of the graphic novel that it originated from. In terms of editorially, I think the only real input I have, because I leave that designing and whatnot to those who are way better at it than I am, is maybe sound-wise. Sound would come into play at times where is a sword clank, or is it a sword clank with a hum, sounding like a lightsaber? So those are the types of things with this movie that either would be suggested to editorial to do, or we would say, oh, well, maybe this could also sound like a motorcycle. And those elements would maybe influence the design down the road at a later point.
You go to great pains to come up with a look for your film, but then sometimes during the film that look changes. And I can think of one example. There's a flashback to Nimona's childhood. It's sort of like an 8-bit style, which is really cool. But at the same time, I could ask, did you run out of money? Because it's just sort of like this low res. Tell me about just coming to that place.
No, that may have cost more money than other things.
Ironic.
Yeah, they wanted it to feel, they knew they wanted to be stylized, because in that case, Nimona's telling her backstory, but it's sort of not the real version of her backstory. So they wanted to have a sense of artifice Originally, they were talking about graffiti maybe taking over there, but they decided, I think there's a little bit of graffiti elements, but that we zoom into the subway tiles and they take on a sort of zoetrope feel with the steel beams that pass when you're on the subway as it whizzes by. So yeah, that was, I mean, I think animators are always looking to indulge in different styles and combining different styles. And I think that was a part of it, but I think it really was to serve the story, that to make it feel that when she's really telling the story, or when we see her story later for real, it's in a more quote unquote real style compared to the rest of the movie. Whereas this one, since she's just bullshitting him, they wanted to have a very stylized version of that.
This is something I probably should have followed up on when I was asking you about styles of animation and referencing different studio looks, I guess. We do talk about reference movies when we talk about live action films. Are there reference shots that you get in animation? Like when we're doing this scene, think about this scene from this movie, or literally this shot from this movie. I want it to look like that. I want it to have something evocative of a feature film that we've seen before.
Yeah, that does come up a lot. I'd be hard pressed to think of a specific example on this movie, but the directors are always bringing reference points like that up for sure. Whether it's even just the acting, we want the arguing, like for example, whether it was with Nimona and Bal or in Spies, that they would maybe reference other movies where characters are just yelling over each other, talking over each other, cutting each other off. So there could be style references that way, or specifically shots that have been brought up. Sometimes we'll dig specifically for those shots on YouTube and send them over to the animators or the layout department and say something along these lines, or something to sometimes exactly this. Maybe not on this show, but I remember other ones where we would specifically grab a shot or two from another movie and say, do this.
Well, earlier you talked about making a choice with sword sound effects. Oh, it should sound just a simple clank, or then a clank and a hum, like a lightsaber. Because of the nature of this medium where the visuals are largely baked in by the animators, is there for you as an editor more of an emphasis on audio? You're putting more thought, more time, more care into the sound design of what you're doing.
Yes, always, always. And in the best version of things, at least from the editorial side of things, when it's animated, it would follow our framework that we've designed. And we try to make it sound as final of a soundscape as possible when we're working on these things. It's not just left for chance as to what the animators will do. Sometimes we'll find that an animator may need time for the character to do something. And so the sound effects where it lands currently would maybe get in the way of that. Maybe we'd have like a door slam over a line, or sometimes there'll be a little bit of a back and forth in terms of us maybe adjusting or moving things. But yeah, we put a great deal of time, energy, and emphasis on having the sound as final as it possibly can, and then throw it all out when we go to post and have our sound designers do it all over in an even better way.
As much as I understand animation, and that's not a ton, it seems to me like it's a very linear process. Like, as you've pointed out earlier, there are these phases that you have to go through. It's almost like they're gated. Like, you can't get to the next one until you get through this one. You talked about the sound effects and just sort of retiming things. That seems like something you'd be able to do with a lot of freedom throughout the process. Whereas needle drops, and in this film, you've got the Tra-La-La song by the Banana Splits, and then you got Breaking the Law by Judas Priest. And then you've got Careless Whisper being played in the subway.
Yeah, good ear.
Maybe we'll have to talk about who chose all that craziness in a second. But with the needle drops, that does seem to be something where you can't really change that later on. Or if you do, you have to be very careful about the beats per minute of the song that you're replacing. Am I way off, or is there some truth in any of that?
No, there's truth to it. We're not always beholden to it, I would say. And it's hard to be beholden to it when, over the lifespan of the movie, the needle drops change. We may have cut a scene to one song and then at the 11th hour change it to another, and then go back in and have to recut. So in some instances, depending on the nature of the scene, it would be so ideal to have the song in the beginning and that you cut it to that and then it's animated to that. Then again, that could sometimes feel too animated, that everything's being hit on a certain beat, or it's just too nice and neat. So we do consider that, but at the same time, depending on the circumstances, that will go out the window, and you just have to make it work to whatever song it becomes. and have a good music editor by your side.
Do you have a hand in any of that? How is the needle drop process on Nimona?
It's funny, when I came on, the needle drops were there, not the ones that were ultimately in the movie, but many of them. And I was told by the producer that, yeah, we've cleared everything and this is how it's going to be and everything's locked. But I should have known with this crew and myself, I guess, they're always going to try to find something that's even better or funnier or more appropriate. And so over the course of the movie, every needle drop that's in there represents probably 5 or 6 that were not in there at one point. So they're chosen by and large by the directors, at least in conversation. I mean, there'll be times where people are just getting out their iPhones and just hit the space bar. And I, hit the space bar and they're holding their phone up and it's playing along. I'm like, oh, that will work. Why don't we get that and drop that in? But we tried so many things, particularly where the Judas Priest song was. I think Bon Jovi's Wanted Dead or Alive was in there for a long time, which I think to a degree, from my perspective, took me out of the movie a little bit. It felt so familiar and so from our world that, and I guess Careless Whisper is kind of that too. It's so identifiable, but the fact that a busker's doing it maybe makes it okay. As a needle drop, the Bon Jovi song was also too expensive. So we also looked for an alternative. And for a while, we couldn't find anything. And then we have our music supervisor, Kier, suggested that one and we played it. And that was sometimes just right away, that's even better than what we had in there that we thought couldn't get any better. And that was an instance of that. That was a real nice surprise when they sent that over.
Breaking the law is always the right answer. Good job.
Yeah,
there.
Exactly.
Again, with it being animated and somebody is manifesting the images, within the Avid, do you bother to even do any sort of retiming or comping of anything? Or is anything you do is temp and then somebody's going to go back and reanimate what you did? How does that process work?
Yeah, we do a ton of comping when it's in storyboards for sure, whether it's drawing smiley faces on people or having eyes look one way or another, correct, or flopping shots or taking a character from another shot and putting them in a shot that they never were in. So we do tons of comping like that. In terms of retiming shots, when it goes to layout, where there's their first, sort of 3D CG camera is placed, we will go in and retime things there, whether it's a camera move, if the camera move was too slow or fast, vice versa, we'll manipulate it that way, or a character's movement we will speed up. Sometimes that happens, and sometimes we'll just cut out when it gets to animation. We may get more granular if there's maybe too much business that the animator added. We'll maybe just cut it out and do a bad edit of a character sitting down when maybe they walked around the chair 3 times before they sat down. We'll cut out the walk and it'll look like a bad edit, but we'll send it back to animation and they'll retime it and clean it up and send it back. So we do have a hand always in timing of things for sure.
Again, I'm not an expert on animation. I think everyone's figured that out by now.
I don't know. You're getting pretty good.
I'm trying. But I've been introduced to a new term, new to me anyway, called sequence-itis. And I think that was from the book Making the Cut at Pixar that we covered on the podcast a while ago. And I'm quoting here, it's a condition of working on a sequence or a scene to the exclusion of the rest of the movie. Way too much time is spent on one scene without stepping back. And the quote here is, in live action, scenes are shot by locations. So every time you change locations, you have a new scene. In animation, here, each sequence is a little movie unto itself. So when you put the movie up, sometimes it feels like there's all these mini movies instead of like a cohesive film. Does that term sequence-itis resonate with you at all?
Yeah, sequence-itis for sure. And we really try to, and I say we, I think a lot of people in editorial that I've worked with try to show early, show often, and show a lot. Sometimes if I have a scene and there's a rough version of a scene that prior to it and maybe an even rougher version after, the more we can show in context, the better, because I think something that happens with the sequence-itis thing is, like you said, it becomes a mini movie of its own where it should have a beginning and a middle and an end, whereas a lot of scenes don't need beginnings or ends. They just need the meat, and you have better propulsion that way. So a lot of times when we do put these things together for the first time, that becomes pretty apparent. Every sequence feels like a reset. And then you have to, it's like you're setting the table, and then steps 1 through 4, where you can come in on a scene on 3 and get out halfway through 4, or maybe not even need the scene. But so, yeah, we really take effort to fight against that and watch as much as possible in context.
Let's talk a little bit about your assistants and the role of the assistant and how it may differ in animation from what that role is in live action.
I would say there's more similarities than differences. Our first assistant was Steve Schwartz, and our second assistant was Ashley Kaye. And then there was a crew of Blue Sky assistants who are too many to name, but we love them all. On this movie, the assistant's job for sure is communication and dissemination of information, if that doesn't sound too boring and technical, to other departments, making sure that other departments have the right version of a cut, which is essential because otherwise it's so wasteful for them to be working on an outdated cut. And that could also mean if I go in and make a 6-frame change on a shot and those frames don't exist, it's their responsibility to make sure that the other departments are aware of that. On this show particularly, we also had would probably normally be a visual effects department, which was our editorial staff at DNEG. So they worked with us as well to organize and disseminate and ingest shots, export cuts. They were connected to our Nexus, so it was really convenient that they could just reach in and grab sequences and do what they needed to do with them.
In looking through the credits, I also noticed there were credits for animation editor and assistant animation editor. So I got to admit, I don't know what those are. What are those roles in comparison to editor and assistant editor?
Those would be who I'd be referencing was what I guess on another show, on a live action show, would be our visual effects editors. So DNEG had an editor, Leslie, and she was the animation editor. And then she had a bunch of assistants. I'm not exactly sure what the division of labor was there because it seems like they all had a hand in doing all the work, whether it was cutting in shots. I mean, we would get 100 shots a day, and that's pretty time consuming for them to get them cut in correctly. I would liken them to like visual effects editors.
So be honest, Randy, when you're watching the credits at the end of one of your movies, are you looking at those names and those titles going, I have no idea who that is or what the hell that job is?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Constantly. Whether it's like fur TD or hair wrangler. Yeah, there's a lot that I don't know for sure.
I guess the important thing is that your name is in there and you know what you do.
That's right.
There was a nod to Blue Sky Studios in the credits. It just said Blue Sky Studios and then just everybody's name, your name was in there without really calling out roles and responsibilities. Was that just a tribute to the former team? What was the idea of having that Blue Sky Studio credit in the end credits?
Yeah, I think it was twofold. I think one was definitely a tribute. And I can remember the first time seeing it, it was pretty emotional to see all those names. And there are these people you've known for years and maybe people you've just known in passing, but you've known them for so long that you're so familiar with them. So I think that was a big part of it. And then I think also, I can't speak to it exactly, but I think it was also just a way of crediting anyone and everyone who was involved in the film during its lifetime at Blue Sky, was to have a sort of one-size-fits-all credit, as opposed to just figuring out specifically who did what, when, and for how long, and how that compared to some people working on the movie since it left Blue Sky. But yeah, I'm glad they did that. That was a real nice thing.
Do you have a favorite part of the process of editing animation?
There's a lot, but I feel like my favorite part is particularly after we've screened the movie, either for execs or for an audience, where you get this feedback, these notes, and sometimes they're nebulous or sometimes they're so specific, but you couldn't possibly do what the note specifically is. So I like the problem-solving aspect of sitting down with the reels and just, the movie's too long. How can we make it shorter? Or we've beat this idea over the head so many times. Where can we pull it out? Those types of things where your creativity comes into play, I find to be a lot of fun. Or where I will just take a scene and if I feel things are too long, which I always seem to feel that way, I love playing the, did you miss it game where you lift stuff from a scene, play it for the directors, and they're like, what'd you do? I said, well, it's, a minute and a half shorter. Really? Yeah. And then sometimes I start listing the things that I did cut out and they're like, oh, no, you got to put that back. But generally speaking, when they don't miss it, that's great. And I enjoy that. There's so many enjoyable aspects for sure.
In animation, it would seem like the jump from editor to director isn't as big a jump as it might be in live action. Do you have any interest in directing animation?
I would say, yeah. I would say yes. And I think you're right. We are so close to every aspect. It's not like we're not on set. I mean, in animation's case, we're on set all the time. We're in all these meetings where things are being shot and created. So we have a really good vantage point. I'd be curious to possibly at least co-direct something with somebody at some point. You feel that way sometimes when you're working, that you are a sort of poor man's director, where you make suggestions that probably in live action wouldn't be that welcome. But when you're working with nice open people and it's a safe space, you can do that. So it isn't that far of a leap, I don't think.
Well, you might be a poor man's director, but like a lot of editors in animation, you're a first-class voiceover artist. If you look closely at the credits, you'll see the name Trager show up a few times.
Mm-hmm.
Your voice is credited to Sir Randall Editus. Even though I did notice Sir Randall Editus in the movie, I think that's the best handle ever given to an editor. Tell me about that bit.
Yeah, well, I was able to make up that character name at the end when they said, "What do you want your character to be called?" And I thought that was about the most appropriate and stupidest name I could come up with. I mean, it's always been this case that because we're just there and we know what we need or want, editors will always be recording themselves to put themselves in, not as a for a payday, but just we need a line here. We need somebody to say this line, and we're the closest to the mic, so we just do it. And so I'm sure I was in there 3 times the amount that I ultimately was in there, and thankfully removed a lot of it. And my kids are as well. Again, it's like who's around, and I'm working from home and I have this microphone and we need a kid. So I grab a blanket, throw it over the mic, and throw my kid under there, and voila.
Well, I got to say, Randy, it's a real testament to you and the team at Blue Sky that Nimona lived on ultimately, and thanks to Netflix, people are going to be able to see it. And the only other thing I'll say is I got a microphone too. If you ever need an extra voice, just give me a call.
Oh, yeah. No, you'd be the first.
They all say that.
Yeah, and I'm just saying it, yeah. Speaking of your voice, I will say, and I know other people have thanked you because I've heard it on the podcast, but I love the podcast. It's great. And it's great when you're home working remotely and I'm not interacting with other editors and trading war stories or hearing how other people do things. It's nice to listen to your podcast and get a sense of that, and the little tips, tricks, or just the commiseration when I hear people talking about some of the same struggles that we go through, because I'm working in a vacuum here. So it's I think providing a mental health service unintentionally.
Wow.
Yeah. No, it's very valuable.
Now I'm going to freeze up on the mic. Thanks, Randy. I'm okay. That was nice of Randy to say. That's the Rough Cut for you. Part podcast, part public service for post-production shut-ins. Glad I could help. More importantly, I'm very glad we got to meet up with Randy again and hear about what went down with Nimona. Keep an eye on your Netflix account. Nimona will be there Friday. It's a fun little movie with a great big heart. Hey, I should be in marketing. Please join me in thanking Randy for giving us both his time and his talent. If it's time for you to maximize your talent, a great way of doing that is sharpening your cutting skills on Avid Media Composer. It's affordable, it's feature-rich, it's fun for the whole family. Lots of great new technology going into the legendary NLE all the time. Go see for yourself. Just click that link in the show notes and it will teleport you over to the Media Composer page on avid.com. Well, that's going to do it for me, my friends. As always, it was a pleasure and an honor hanging out with you. Let's do it again next week. Until then, this is Matt Fury thanking you for joining me right here on The Rough Cut.